Equity in joy, equity in grief. Perhaps you are familiar with Ecclesiastes chapter 3, wherein the book's narrator asserts that there is a season for everything: birth and death, planting and reaping, weeping and laughing. Rumi, in our reading for today, suggests that these seasons might arrive concurrently, demanding of us an open door to experience them all. Or, as Anne Voskamp writes, joy and pain, they are but two arteries of one heart that pumps through all those that don't numb themselves to really living. Now, whether they arrive in distinct seasons or all at once, like Tennessee weather, what of those who are not afforded the freedom and safety to weep or to laugh? Those for whom it may not be safe yet to open the door to Rumi's unexpected visitors. Those who find themselves forced to lean into numbness. I know there are people who bristle at the term safe space, in part due to a misunderstanding of its original intentions, especially since that phrase has been co-opted and weaponized to suggest that anyone seeking a safe space is overly coddled and shielded from reality and unable to handle the slings and arrows of life's day-to-day inconveniences. The reality, though, is that experiencing grief and joy, weeping and rejoicing requires some degree of safety, whether that safety is physical or psychological or both. Have you ever been through a crisis and found that you were somehow amazingly stoic until everything calmed down and the crisis was over, and then you broke down? You could finally breathe long enough to have a good cry or to actually feel your feelings, to have them all come rushing in. Or have you ever been unable to be present in a joyous moment? Perhaps you felt pressured to celebrate, but found yourself waiting for the other shoe to drop, skeptical and suspicious of that moment of joy and serenity in the midst of life's challenges and traumas. As death doula and documentarian Teresa de Sautel's notes, the act of grieving is a privilege. It means you are safe enough to process what has been lost. As Sherry Fries writes, joy is pure vulnerability. Whenever we feel vulnerable, fear sets in. Grief and joy require vulnerability, and vulnerability requires safety. Feeling these emotions and processing them or expressing them requires safety. As author and social worker Jessica Dorr writes, emotions are often passed down through generations until they reach someone who has the right set of resources and abilities to resolve them, which is to say, to clear a space for them to emerge, unfold, and find full expression. Water has long been a symbol of birth and life, and I would argue, she says, that emotions which are associated with water simply want what all other life wants. Emotions want to be born, to have safe space to express fully, and to die, eventually, as all living things do. And our human impulse is often to deny our feelings that fundamental right instead of protecting them. And many of us, and if many of us, even in the midst of relatively mundane, everyday lives, find it challenging at times to make space to breathe, to grieve, to lean into joy, how much more of a challenge is the breathing, the grieving, the leaning into joy for those who can't catch a moment's peace and safety? And here I want to take a moment, if you will allow me, to acknowledge that a discussion that centers equity and grief and even joy cannot be made without considering the relentless loss of civilian lives in Gaza. Let us take a moment to reflect on the interconnectedness of every life lost and every life still at risk, the worth and dignity of every human being, regardless of what side of a wall they live on, or where they fall in the writing and mapping of political boundaries. Let us take a moment to acknowledge those who find themselves ongoing targets for bloodshed, those who do not have the luxury of the safety required to pause, to catch their breath, to grieve the loss of countless loved ones. And let us affirm our collective will that they would soon have that peace, that safety, that equity to grieve, and to one day return to some place of joy. And while the experiences of those on the ground in Gaza involve threats to their physical survival, famine, lack of clean water, medical care and supplies, enduring bombings and shellings, there are other factors that can lead to a lack of safety and freedom to grieve that may be less immediately violent, but are still quite significant, especially in the long term. Experiences of disenfranchised grief, or grief that is described by Kenneth Doka as being socially invalidated and unacknowledged. While the topic of equity in grief and the experiences of disenfranchised grief touches a number of marginalized and minoritized communities, since we are on the second day of Pride Month, and since my ministry focus has been on the LGBTQIA+ community, a community of which I am a part as a queer non-binary human, a ministry that creates space for members of the community to acknowledge and process their grief, let's start there. There are multiple factors that make it challenging for many members of the LGBTQIA+ community to get to the safe enough to process place that Teresa de Sotels describes, even for the more typical griefs that are not unique to the queer and gender nonconforming experience on the surface. Instances where identity is questioned or actively negated, when grief and loss is invalidated or blamed on your identity, when you lack the time and space to hold it, particularly if your identity has contributed to being under-resourced, when you're forced to pretend it doesn't exist or to hide your identity, when you're left out of memorial services for a loved one, when your home life or housing situation is tenuous or actively abusive, or when you just have no time to grieve because you're trying to survive, particularly with the relentless horrors of living under a system that is constantly passing laws to stifle and negate your own existence. The grief support group I've been facilitating here as a crucial part of my role as student minister and my ongoing work thereafter is a step in creating a safe space for acknowledging and processing grief. Though it could be argued that doing the work of holding space for grief experienced by those in the LGBTQIA+ community, both commonplace griefs and griefs specific to one's queer and gender nonconforming experience, does not directly create equity in the broader world, and that is work that must be done. Nor does it remove all of the barriers to accessing and processing grief. It does signal grief's equity in the room, whether that's in a virtual space or in the meeting room. The work says, no matter what they're telling you out there, you are with others who understand. Let yourself breathe for a moment. We see you, I see you. Your loss is real, your pain is valid. I see your grief and I hold it with gentle care. The late Harvey Peskin noted in his piece, Who Has the Right to Mourn?, that going through the painful experiences of loss, grief, and mourning without a community to support or acknowledge the loss can add to the emotional pain and distort what might otherwise be an adaptive process. Permission to grieve belongs to a relational process of recognizing loss through the real or virtual company of others and is more essential to the process of mourning than we often let ourselves know. This acknowledgement and permission to grieve is crucial. Disenfranchised grief that remains unprocessed and unsupported can pose risks to mental, physical, and emotional well-being, including an increased risk of suicide or suicidal thoughts. Room to grieve can become a protective factor against these consequences, deepening the imperative to seek and provide equity in grief. But what of equity in joy? Joy is deeper and more visceral than mere happiness, and as such, joy is vulnerable. As Mary Clark Moskella describes, joy is not an escape from sorrow or a turning away from suffering. Joy involves being awake and not numb, attuned to life in the present moment, with all of its sweetness as well as its sorrows. Joy allows one to experience deep sorrow with less fear, because the precious and precarious dimensions of life present themselves as intertwined. And just as there are factors that stifle the safety to experience and express grief, there are those that stifle the safety to experience and express joy in an equitable way. In her piece on ways we unconsciously stifle happiness, Veronica Tai notes that when someone expresses joy that breaks gender or cultural norms, their feelings are more likely to be disregarded. She continues, sometimes we rob the joy of others because society has deemed their enthusiasm inappropriate. Some other factors that might come into play are lacking the permission to find joy, or always having one story needing to focus on the hard parts. Like the only story that can be told about the queer and trans community is the horrors that are experienced. Our joy could be stifled by family members and loved ones who refuse to participate in our moments of joy, whether that's a wedding ceremony or acknowledging coming out or gender-affirming care. Difficulty accessing joy when you're just trying to survive, whether that's due to interpersonal violence or state violence of relentless oppression. Tenuous rights to joy. We get marriage equality and they're trying to rip it back. Or when traditional allies give in to squelching and suppressing support due to pressure and threats from outside sources. In a few weeks, thousands of members of the LGBTQIA+ community and many allies will march down Broadway, myself likely included once I figure out which group I'm going to join, to kick off the Nashville Pride Festival. When I marched in the Pride Parade last year, which I loved, I recall the scowls of tourists at the honky-tonks who didn't realize they'd mistimed their Nashville visit, and the boisterous anti-Pride protesters, including a rotating crew of unaffirming Christians on loudspeakers outside the gates of the festival, telling passersby how they can turn from their sin. But these experiences that chip away at the LGBTQIA+ experience of safety and joy are everywhere, and they don't just show up during Pride weekend. It could be as simple as people on Facebook when there are stories of queer and trans joy offered up and they hit the angry or laughing reaction, or they enter the comments to spew hate and mockery or share Bible verses extolling how much they enjoy the idea of hell. In their actions and in their words, they say, "We don't want to hold space for your grief because you brought it on yourself for being gay or lesbian or trans or whatever it is that you are, and we sure don't want to hold space for your joy either. Be happy if you must, but don't shove it in our faces." Towns pass laws against pride flags, book bans, protests and threats cause stores like Target to pull their pride merch displays. Drag queen story hours are met with armed protesters. Such stifling of joy through the stifling of the safety to experience joy robs us of joy's benefits. Benefits that include fighting stress and pain, boosting the immune system, supporting longevity. LGBTQIA+ joy is life-saving. And as pride memes that are posted all over Facebook and Instagram right now note, pride is suicide prevention. And we all need joy at a deeper spiritual level, all of us, no matter our identities. As Mary Clark Moskella writes in a chapter on elements of joy and lived practices of care, in a book titled Joy and Human Flourishing, Essays on Theology, Culture, and the Good Life, we also need joy in the sense of aliveness, awareness of both pleasure and pain in the body for moral reasons. The bodily awareness of pleasure and pain affects our capability to empathize with other bodies in pain or in joy. Our ability to empathize with others. We need to experience that so we can empathize with others. We need this holistic aliveness in order to know right and wrong in our bones, in order to be able to understand, know, and defend basic human dignity, and to promote human flourishing. Seeking out and embodying equity in grief and equity in joy creates a ripple effect that has an impact on our communal well-being. Moskella continues, joy is both corporeal and corporate. It is linked to what we feel in our bodies and in our communities and our bodies of faith. Joy often arises out of deep interpersonal connections and the experiences of loving and being loved. It may also arise in communities of resistance to evil or injustice. So what do we do to lean into expansive joy and hold space for deep grief? How do we contribute to equity and the safety to experience that joy and process that grief? First, I want to thank you for the work that you're already doing. We have the Trans Affirming Collective here. You have your designation as a welcoming congregation. In April, you hosted a local portion of the Beloved Community Beyond the Binary Conference. We hosted a vigil here after the death of Next Benedict, which made room for our community to grieve together, which was so needed. You'll be hosting the Pride Spirituality Night a few weeks from now, which affirms the worth and dignity and joy of the LGBTQIA+ community from multiple religious perspectives. And you hold space for me to facilitate the LGBTQIA+ grief support group that's been meeting here almost weekly since before Thanksgiving. A space where people come from as far as Watertown and Chapel Hill to feel safe, to be vulnerable, and to grieve. A space that is healing through community. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And let's continue to lean in. Lean into our designation as a welcoming congregation and expand upon that welcome. Some of that work is deeply intrapersonal and reflective. We can reflect upon our own attitudes or actions that may contribute to our LGBTQIA+ siblings feeling a little less safe and less supported in our midst than they should, whether here or in the broader community. We can make small changes in the ways that we interact that help our queer and gender nonconforming siblings know that they are safe or safer with us at least. Small steps that let them drop their tense shoulders, relax, and breathe when they are with us, and not feel like they have to be on guard for the next thing and the next. This work is also interpersonal and systemic. It involves pushing back against a culture that asks of all of us, regardless of our identities, to push past our own pain, to ignore our grief, and to dampen our joy in service of productivity, of the economy, of civility, and of upholding the status quo. We can speak up when the hate is flying. Members of the LGBTQIA plus community notice not just our actions, but our silence. We can advocate for a community, a city, a state, and a world that will offer those disenfranchised from their grief and joy the space to feel and express both by advocating for safety and equity and against repressive and regressive laws and policies. And until that day comes, we can offer spaces that allow a full range of emotions in their expression, joy and grief, laughter and weeping. This is not easy work, but we are each equipped for it if we're willing to journey through a little bit of discomfort. Our interdependence requires of us a striving for greater compassion, greater justice, and greater welcome. Caring for all of our siblings in their grief, in their pain, in their joy, and in their flourishing, and in all the moments in between, as they open the door to each of Rumi's visitors, is sacred work, vital work, urgent work, life-sustaining, life-giving, and life-saving work. It is liberatory work. May this offering stir each of us to take up and continue this sacred work. The well-being of our siblings whose grief and joy have been disenfranchised, and our interconnected flourishing hangs in the balance. Every moment matters.